Thank you for 3 very, very interesting talks, a lot of food for thought and conversation. So I guess the burning question from where I stand is what works? So you all talked about different types of interventions from education, persuasion, coercion, choice architecture. There is a whole range that each of you referred to. Do we know what works? How do we decide what type of intervention is going to work? There's the plastic bag tax, there is nudging, there are a lot of different approaches. We'd love to hear from each of you.
I'm happy to start. I think the answer is one size doesn't fit all. Several years ago, the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee had a year-long inquiry into behaviour change because they wanted to establish exactly the question you ask, what works, so they could advise government in terms of this is what works in terms of policies that will support behaviour change. And I was an expert witness. I saw other people who were expert witnesses, and they were very frustrated by our answers because our answers were variations on it depends. And it depends on the population. You know, are we talking about teenage girls? Are we talking about elderly men? It depends on the setting, whether you're in a GP clinic, in your home. It depends on the country, etc. So I think it's very important not to be oversimplistic. There are various general laws or rules that we can apply, but you can think, well, this works. So, for example, reward is probably one of the most evidence-based interventions. Very simply, if you reward somebody's behaviour, it tends to become more frequent. But then we've seen it applied in ways where the understanding of science behind it hasn't been there. For example, with GPs trying to increase the rate of referral to smoking cessation, specialist smoking cessation services that we know are very effective, will save thousands of lives. And there was a particular thing called the Quality Outcomes Framework, and they got reimbursed, they got rewarded financially for making those referrals. So, or actually for having had a discussion with the patient. So what happened was there's a lot of tick boxing of having discussions. It didn't actually end up with more referrals. And the other thing that happened is that because not all the behaviours, GP behaviours, were being rewarded, the ones that weren't went down. And so lots of things that had been part of what GPs were doing, this is an unintended consequence. And also, there was another thing that happened was that GPs became more dissatisfied and demoralised because they felt they were being treated not in terms of their professional expertise, but just being rewarded for certain behaviours. And we saw a lot of people GPs taking early retirement, working part-time, etc.
Clearly not the desired outcome.
Yeah, so that's an example of you can say, well, rewards work, but then when you look at the particular situation, how it's delivered, then not always.
And what about in the domain of environmental behaviors? And Nick and Toby, you're both working in those areas. You can go brute force, regulate, legislate, tax, and you can nudge. You can sort of create a choice environment or framing where you nudge people in the right direction. What works for those big problems, sustainability, for instance?
So, I mean, I certainly agree that there's no one-size-fits-all, absolutely. And the role of applying behavioural insights is not to sort of open up your drawer of tricks and apply them indiscriminately. It's very much a sort of process of diagnosis, understanding what the problem is, what are the drivers and the barriers associated with the behaviour, and so on. That said, I mean, if I was to pick a few techniques that generally do work, I think rule 101 of behavioural science, if you want to encourage a behaviour, make it easier. So removing frictions and barriers and so on, that tends to be quite effective. In terms of within the context of sustainability, certainly there's a large body of evidence to say that merely raising awareness is often not sufficient. We tend to have a big gap between our knowledge and our intentions and our attitudes in this subject matter and our actual behaviours. Not always, the two can certainly be related. but often we want or intend to be more sustainable, but actually we're not willing to give up our car or big home or take the train on holiday, etc. So, I mean, that's partly why making things easier is often effective if you can remove those barriers. One, just to get specific, one common mistake I think that tends to be made by the sustainability community is using messages of sort of guilt or fear or anxiety. And those can certainly be motivating emotions, of course.
You simply turn off.
But you do
Don't
simply
wanna
turn off.
hear
Exactly.
anymore.
So you can alleviate guilt in one of two ways. You either do the thing that you're feeling guilty about not doing, or you bury the guilt and you avoid the message. So you avoid a sort of avoidance-motivated reasoning and so on. You justify your behaviour to yourself. And that's often the path of least psychological resistance. So we tend to take that option of just ignoring that. There's a lovely study, not in the sustainability context, but asking or encouraging people to eat less chocolate cake. This very sort of artificial, classic psychological experiment, put people in some bizarre artificial situation and see how they behave. But people were offered chocolate cake, 3 groups, put into a room with chocolate cake. One of them received no message at all. Another group received a sort of guilt message. Imagine how guilty you'll feel if you eat all this chocolate cake. Another one received a pride message. Imagine how proud you feel if you don't eat the chocolate cake. The pride group was most successful. They ate the least. But interesting, the guilt group ate more than the ones that had no message at all.
So for everybody, pat yourself on the back next time you don't have that pesky biscuit or naughty biscuit. What about the more complex problems that involve interaction amongst various actors, where you need collectively to shift the behavior of an entire system? So, for instance, your work on the Climate Change Committee, Nick, that's that level of problem.
Well, I think for that kind of problem, and indeed for lots of problems, it's not obviously the case that the right solution to a behavioural problem is a behavioural solution. I mean, sometimes the lesson from behaviour is just legislate this, just make people do it, because then they'll do it. Or a technological solution might work. So thinking about, for example, washing machines, certainly, in fact, actually, it's interesting because, I mean, people don't pay much attention to the labels on the washing machines. The manufacturers do. So once you've got a labeling system out there, the manufacturers will all think, oh my goodness, we've got to be really good on that labeling system because someone might be understand it. Most of us won't pay much attention, but that's okay, actually, because the industry at large will be incentivized, and it actually has improved its efficiency a lot. But if you think about what we really want to be doing is shifting of the load of our electricity across the day in a more efficient way, you do get people saying, well, it's very important to incentivize people to remember to run your washing machine at night or all this kind of thing. But that really is, that's a marginal could have marginal effect. I think the thing you really want to do is to have intelligent washing machines that find when the electricity is most available, is cheapest, and run then. So if you have smart appliances, it's not our problem anymore. And a lot of the time, I think that is actually the solution. It's just, we are not going to spend our lives trying to optimize the amount of greenhouse gas impact we have on the planet. It's too complicated, we can't figure it out. So the more that problem can be taken away from us, the better. Having said that, it's also true where we do want people to change their behavior, we need to tell them what behavior is actually relevant. So going back to my thought about having some analog of prices, which are essentially your, as it were, planetary impact price. If I had every time I bought anything, it had £1 and £2 in call it carbon, the 2 carbon pounds, or £1 and only 50p of carbon pounds, then as soon as I bought a flight or filled up a tank of petrol, I think, oh my goodness, this is terrible, because I can see the damage. But I actually have no sense of scale unless I've done the calculations, unless I'm thinking about it. And I also, whatever those calculations are, they tend to be presented in a way I have no concept of how they relate to each other, how to relate to what other people are doing. Whereas money, I do understand. So having something in a common currency which everybody understands, and that is potentially, I think, quite powerful. But in any case, the general point is, if we're getting people to optimize something, they have to be able to measure it. And at the moment, we can't. We have no idea, most of us, very little idea of what the impacts of our behavior are.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And one thing that came up in, I think, at least 2 of your talks, the notion of rationality, that we're rational beings. I'm Greek, I grew up with Aristotle, We are rational animals. A lot of philosophers thereafter said the same. And mainstream economics also says that it's based on rational choice theory. We're rational actors. We try to maximize utility. We put down all the facts and we come up with the best solution. Are we rational? And to what extent does that play into changing our behaviors? So, Toby?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I tend not to use the word rational, irrational, because it is a bit value-laden. It's a bit, to say, this has caused problems in the field. To say that people are irrational is perhaps a bit simplistic and misleading. But certainly, we have a range of sort of cognitive traits that cause us to perhaps think in ways that deviate from that sort of classic economic understanding of optimization and utility maximization and so on. So we're certainly subject to a range of cognitive biases. Certainly, your pointing about the sort of relativism of our thinking would perhaps not be reflected in a hyper-rational understanding. The fact that we're so susceptible to social influence isn't necessarily irrational in any given situation, but it's certainly something which is underappreciated in a more simplistic sort of utility maximizing understanding. So yeah, human behavior and decision making is complex. There's a range of both cognitive sort of artifacts, but also contextual factors that influence that. But I guess the important point as well is that they're kind of systematic and predictable in certain directions. So we can say that empirically, on average, people, for example, feel losses more severely than they feel gains. What that means is that losing £10 will hurt more than gaining £10 will feel good. So you can think about using that in the context of a incentive, for example. So a study has shown that if you pay teachers for performance, in other words, the better your students do, the more you earn, that is not as good as paying them at the beginning of the year and retracting it if they don't meet that performance. A slightly unappetizing policy, but it works because then they feel the loss of that money rather than the gain of it. So you can use these kind of things in systematic ways.
Okay. But what about for those using those techniques that rely more on understanding people's biases and using them for their own good? How much does the individual have freedom of choice? Is there any worry that choice is manipulated? Because, if you present me with 3 things and you make sure that there is a really big thing so that I feel that the next big thing isn't too big for me and buy it, is there, in a sense, a manipulation of my choice? Nick, is this something that...
I think that is a real concern. So going back to the virtual bargaining idea, the idea that when we're interacting with other people or with organizations, we have, apart from the actual communication we engage in, there's a sort of large hidden set of assumptions. And we feel that the interaction is a good, positive, fair interaction if the assumptions are shared. And if they're not, we don't. And so if I'm encouraged to buy a very large amount of popcorn by this clever trick with the popcorn hoppers, and I don't know about that, and you wouldn't tell me about that, and in fact it's totally shocking to me that this is happening, then that's not a case of we're sharing our information and all starting from the same page. You're tricking me, essentially. You're using a mechanism secretly which you wouldn't tell me about. And I think that's actually gives a very important desideratum, which I know BIT are very keen on implementing, and we are too, which is that anything you do in the terms of behavioural manipulation, you want that to be as open as possible. So you probably want it actually to be open, to say, we're doing this, and this is why we're doing it. And if anyone wants to find out, they can find out, and maybe it's even completely transparent, as it were, in the leaflet or on the letter. I mean, a lot of the time, this is actually obvious. I mean, in the case of trying to get GPs to prescribe less. I mean, no GP is going to think, I don't know what your hidden agenda is here. They all know what they want you to do is to prescribe less antibiotics. And that's completely obvious. So there's no hidden trickery.
So
but I think
the idea is transparency.
Transparency, I think, is super, super important. There's no such thing as a neutral way of framing information. So whatever you say, it's pushing someone one way or another. But what you really do want to do is to make sure that you're interacting with people in a way that, were it to become completely transparent what you were doing and why you were doing it, they'd think, yeah, fair enough, I sort of knew that, rather than, oh my goodness, that's horrifying. And if we too much go down the latter route, then we're in danger of discrediting the very good things that behavioural science can do, particularly from the point of view of government. Of course, companies do this a lot. We kind of know they do that because that's what they're there to do, as it were. I mean, they want us to buy popcorn, so it's kind of annoying if they try and trick us into buying more, but we don't think, well, I'm just totally outraged and astounded. That's sort of, maybe a little bit, but that's sort of what we expect. But with government, we really don't want them to be doing things that are not transparent, because governments are supposed to be directly acting in our interests.
And actually, just before we started, we were having a very interesting conversation with Susan and Toby on exactly this topic. So behavioral science is available to everybody. You can download the research papers, open up the journals, talk to the scientists, and you can be a gambling organization and adopt the science in a way that you want to promote more gambling. You can adopt the same tools to promote more alcohol consumption. You can use those tools. How can the practitioners and scientists who are in it for the good, how can you help prevent that? Or how does a society guard itself against these possibilities?
I think one has to be very aware of the political context in which we all do our work, because I think it's one thing to say everybody should be transparent. That's very nice, but when a lot of industry trying to make profit by engendering wants and needs, and often fears and anxieties about, I should look different, and therefore go and buy new clothes and buy cosmetics and get surgery, etc. I think it's going to be very difficult to make that happen unless you have governments taking on vested interests. And so I think it's where behavioural scientists have to be quite humble about what we can and can't do, because I think there's much bigger forces out there. And certainly with our Centre for Behaviour Change, we have an ethical code of conduct, and we don't do any research or do any work that's funded by 4 industries: the tobacco industry, the alcohol industry, the gambling industry, and the arms industry, because there's such good evidence that those industries are not for promoting health and human well-being, which is what we're about. So whilst I think you're absolutely right that the more we can arm people with awareness about how their behaviour is being manipulated by forces for maybe not so good as well as forces for good, the better it puts them in a position to be able to understand and control it and manage it for themselves. But I think that's very, very good, and I think it should be taught in schools, right from early on, about how our behaviour is being massaged. And in fact, there's good evidence that children who are taught about the techniques that the tobacco industry use, selling things on the basis of it being associations with all sorts of attractive things, means that they're less likely to take up smoking than if they're not. There's been some really interesting work in that area done in the States.
And the BIT is quite interested in distinguishing, making sure you are transparent, but also how the science is applied.
Absolutely, and just to build on that, and you're right, by the way, that we're being influenced and nudged all the time, and normally it's for profit. So those of us that try and nudge for good, whether it's in the environmental space, health space, or whatever, we're sort of a drop in the ocean pushing the other way. But you raise an interesting point, I think, that touches on this idea of sort of more behavioural regulation. So when you're thinking about gambling and so on, or indeed tech market, the likes of Facebook, YouTube and so on, are using these techniques to get us to spend longer on the websites and so on. We need a more behavioural lens on consumer protection laws, essentially. So, governments have conventionally only really intervened in markets when they perceive there to be some kind of negative externality or some kind of lack of information asymmetry. In other words, if there's a lack of clarity with a product that's being sold and people are being hoodwinked, they might intervene. If there's some massive negative consequence of products or services, they might intervene. What they've not really done until more recently, and this kind of science has emerged, is thinking about what we might call internalities. In other words, there might be negative consequences on consumers, not because of something that's happening external to them, but because of their own cognitive limitations, for want of a better word. In other words, the fact that we can be influenced into spending way longer than we, on our own terms, would judge good on Facebook. The fact that we can be sucked into spending way more money than we would judge as appropriate on a gambling website. These are genuine market failures in the sense that it is a flaw in the system that is leading to suboptimal outcomes for society. But it's a market failure that's rooted in behavioural elements rather than in sort of traditional economic elements. So there is an increased awareness, certainly in the UK government. We've contributed to some of these ideas around sort of behavioural consumer protection. And really these need to be taken into account, because otherwise, particularly in this day and age, it's becoming increasingly easy for corporations to powerfully use these techniques to our disadvantage.
Yeah. That's a very, very good point, a very good series of points. I want to make sure that we're not eating into your time. So we're 1 hour in, and we have half an hour, the remaining half hour, for your questions. So there will be microphones here. I want to make sure, I'm afraid I can't see the gallery very well. So I want to make sure that everybody has the chance to ask a question. Let me just scan one question here, one question here, one question here, there, and quite a few. Oh, let's start from the gallery.
Behind you.
Let's start from the gallery.
Yes, thank you for the talk. Speaking as parent of 2 boys, does some of the behavior change we talk about today, how does that differ over age? Do you find certain, whether it's age or gender, is more predisposed to certain methods of influencing? Thank you.
This isn't an area of my expertise, actually, but certainly there is some evidence along gender lines, particularly, actually, interestingly, in the environmental space. So females tend to be more concerned about the environment, more willing to change their behaviour, adopting vegetarian diets, for example. But it's not a massively strong effect. Age certainly is one in the environmental space, as you might predict. There tends to be a bit of a correlation of increasing concern for the environment towards the younger end of the spectrum, but not always increasing action. So there is some research from the Department of Environment in the UK showing that with regards to plastic use, for example, younger people are much more concerned, but they're no more likely to actually be better in their use of plastics. So take that for what you will, but so again, it sort of highlights this sort of gap between our values and our actions and so on. So there's more to it than that, but yes, I think there's a lot of research on age and gender, but
I could just add, in the health arena, men tend to be much more avoidant of symptoms or suggestions of ill health, much more reluctant to go and seek health care than women.
Yeah, just to add another very quick thing, there's a Swedish study looking at the effects of paying people to donate blood, which is usually viewed as negative. So if you pay people, then they tend to do it less. And that is true for women, but much less true for men, for reasons that nobody really understands. But so in gender, I think most of the time, the gender and demographic effects are usually of secondary importance. People differ a lot, but these are not actually big predictors. But there are strange big effects in unexpected places.
It's really interesting. Plays into stereotypes quite a bit.
It's worth saying as well, there's a huge overlap between the two, between any population. So whilst on an average, there might be a difference that's meaningful and interesting, there's a massive overlap.
No, that makes sense. Martin, shall we take another question from the gallery before we move downstairs?
Thank you again for a very interesting talk. If you look at 2 recent examples where the government has been particularly slow or dragged its feet on certain changes, so I'm thinking of slot machines in gambling shops, where there was lots of evidence about the kind of people who would be spending money they haven't really got, and the government dragged its feet for a few years before it eventually pulled the plug. And secondly, the coffee tax or coffee cup tax, which was almost introduced last year, but it wasn't introduced. So if we recognise that governments won't necessarily do what we want them to do, even though all the evidence suggests they should be doing it, any thought, so is the work you're doing looking to work with government on these sort of issues? And if you are, how come it's not working?
Well, I think we all work with government in different ways. I'm part of a behavioural science policy research unit, which has been set up by the Department of Health and Social Care to advise government policy on health-related issues and provide the evidence. I think one of the issues is there's not a nice, neat translational pathway between the scientific evidence of what should be done and how to do it, and that seeing its way into policy and then changes on the ground. I think, again, we need to think about this as a complex system. The evidence and the scientists' advice is only one tiny part of it, but all of your behaviour in terms of lobbying and whatever else you might be doing to show your views is also a very important influence on government because, politicians want to be elected again by their electorate. So I think that, I did say earlier that the sustained behaviour change and the really effective behaviour change is when you get lots of things happening simultaneously that all come together. And I think that is an important part. So we're only a small part of the system, albeit I'd say an important one.
And, the machine of government is not exactly known for its pace. So I don't know if those two examples are unique. Of course, lobbying groups are real, and that has a certain impact. Gambling, in particular, is an enormous revenue generator for government through tax and so on. But my experience is there's a lot of genuinely good people trying to make progress in government. In fact, the vast majority of them. But these are complex issues, and they do tend to be slow to be realised. Interesting. The behavioural science also has something to say about sort of consent and acceptability of policy. My view is that policymakers and politicians tend to be quite risk averse, perhaps unnecessarily so. The evidence from things like smoking bans, congestion charges, plastic bag taxes, etc., which have all generally been pretty unpopular in the public eye before they're implemented. Public opinion tends to switch more or less overnight once they're implemented. And there's a few reasons for this, partly because we're quite averse to change. We're loss averse. What that means, as I mentioned earlier, we're much more sensitive to things we might lose out on as a consequence of this policy. And we only really appreciate ththings we're going to gain after it's been implemented. So you can often see quite a significant shift in public appetite after a policy is enacted. But I don't think policymakers and politicians necessarily recognise that. So there's a certain risk aversiveness to pushing forwards these more radical changes.
Thank you. I am going to jump the queue for two people who are very, very keen to ask a question. Here, the younger people who can make the biggest difference.
There's been a recent scandal in the Sackler Fellow giving money. Would you accept funds from that source? And you prepared to forfeit potential gain for an open quote mark moral good close quote mark?
Did you catch that?
Which of our panelists would like to take this?
I didn't get.
I'll have a go. I haven't taken any money from. So the question is, would you take money from the Sackler Foundation? And of course, Sackler have been, it appears, closely involved in the explosion of opioids in the US, especially. So there's great controversy, quite reasonably great controversy around the Sackler, the source of the Sackler wealth. I think we do have to be very careful about which money we use because it does send signals about the acceptability of organisations that are giving that money. I have no particular knowledge of this case, but I think in general that's something we all have to be very careful of. I think it's a very valid point. Of course, with an interconnected world and interconnected economy, all money comes from somewhere. If you traced it back far enough, you'd wonder quite what its sort of moral provenance was. We can't be overzealous, but I think it's a valid question. We should, as researchers and scientists, we should be concerned about.
Yeah, and I guess maybe just to respond, the Behavioural Insights Team is not fully part of government, but we're very close to government and partially owned by government. So from that perspective. Just to echo your points, really, Nick. There's certainly ambiguous cases. So, for example, if we were asked by a fast food chain to help them sell more Coke, that's a very obvious no. But if we were asked by a fast food chain to help them encourage people to take water instead of Coke with a meal, we would think about that. Frankly, it would probably still be no, because optics do matter and it does send a signal, and we need to think carefully about that. But ultimately, you do sometimes have to work in the system to change the system. So, we have these frank discussions when these kind of situations arise. Again, I'm not particularly familiar with this case, and certainly we've not done any work on that.
Great.
May I just say, a couple of you touched a little bit on the economic manipulation of what you buy. Now, is that relatively modern, or has that been there for quite a long time? And what kind of sparked it?
Very, very good question. I think that what we're sort of talking about is vested interests with buying and selling. There's buying and selling where things are useful, and then there's buying and selling where things aren't particularly useful. And I think over time, there's been much more potential to make really huge amounts of money by very sophisticated advertising, which can persuade you that you want or need something that you actually don't want or need. So if one's looking over time, I think there's a lot more selling of things that people don't want and need than used to be the case. But I think if your generation is going to thrive and do well in a planet that's thriving and doing well, I think we all need to think about consuming less and buying less.
So would an example of that be a lot of companies issue new replicas of what's been before, for example, different fans over time? Would that be an example of what you don't actually need to buy, but what you're tempted to buy?
Exactly. And I think that two of the big areas that's true of is fashion. You know, I think it would be wonderful if there's a whole movement of people buying their clothes from what used to be called second-hand clothes shops, but I think will be called something more different in the future, because otherwise we just are going to consume and, you know, take up all the energy. But people think, well, I've got to have this new thing, otherwise I'm going to look old-fashioned. And the other is technology. Do we really need this new version of the whatever model of a telephone, you know, mobile phone or whatever? Probably not. So I think very good points.
Guys, you're right on the money. Well done. There is a question here. Yep. Yes.
Hello. Thanks very much for, I think it's a very interesting talk about, I guess, primarily the sort of techniques that work when setting about behaviour change, but I've actually heard very little about the science so far. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts, about specifically the science of behaviour change and how that may increase over the next, say, 5-10 years. If you look 5-10 years out, what do you think this whole field looks like?
That's a big question.
Well, I mean, just to say a tiny bit, I think one of the things about the science of behaviour change is that's worth stressing, which is very much something that we're all very closely involved with, is improving the methodology. So it's not just that we have an increasing battery of clever things that will work, it's having really rigorous methods of testing what works and what doesn't. Because things do tend to work or not work in surprising ways. So certainly my experience, both in behaviour change and also in lab experiments, which I'm involved with a lot of those, I'm always, invariably being surprised with experiments that I think are bound to work, which don't, or manipulations I think are bound to work, which don't, and sometimes ones which I think aren't likely to work, which do. So I think the thing that probably will be most important is getting methods which are able to test things really fast and really effectively. So clearly using technology to do that, rolling things out very quickly, I think that's where the action is, really. I mean, whether if we do understand the basic science substantially better, that will also be brilliant, but that's a slow process. But I think that technology is allowing us to make interventions and evaluate them using wearables and using the web and so on in a way that's really quite exciting. So I think there's hope, there's real hope.
I agree with that, and I'd also add, I mean, in a way you can think about science as evidence, what we know, methods, and also theory, how we understand things. And I think we can, I'm involved in this, and I think there's big advances being made. We did a review looking at theories of behaviour change and identified 83 different theories. And now a lot of these were overlapping, but theories are meant to be really encapsulating and summarising what we know about a field. So work that I'm doing, and in collaboration with computer science, is specifying those theories in a computer-readable format where we can synthesise all of that and really look at where the strength is of what does cause what in what situations. So I think the theoretical understanding is another important aspect of science.
There is another question here.
So I am a medic, and for me as a medic, very important is to actually teach my colleagues what they should be teaching the patients. As you know, the research show the healthier is the physician, the fitter, the slimmer, the actually healthier, fitter and slimmer become the patients, simply because they can address the issues much more in a much better way. And as a medic, every single year, I'm asked to do 50 hours of development in my profession. And majority is spent on year after year of teaching me of manual handling and how to run away from the fire, but not one how to teach behavior, not one how to become healthy physician. And there is nothing in the hospital GP practice which encourage us to be healthy. You will be pleased that we have now British Society of Lifestyle Medicine and plant-based actually healthcare professionals. And we are fighting very, very strongly to fight for the behavior and for the change of the professionals to lead actually to healthier patients. My question is, can you support us with the policies, go to the core, fight actually our, not fight, but support us to become healthy so we can then make our patients healthy?
That's a great question.
I mean, simply to say good for you. I mean, that's fantastic. I mean, you're right to point out the importance of leading by example. There's some interesting evidence in this in the sustainability space that I lead as well. The credibility of the messenger is so important if you're trying to encourage behaviour change in others. So just one small example, research has shown that people who are in the business of selling solar panels are much more effective at that job if they have installed solar panels themselves. It's this idea of a sort of convert, a sort of converted individual who they've clearly made that decision. They can therefore speak with credibility about it. So that's really important. I mean, you know, I wholeheartedly support your efforts there, and it sounds like there's certainly a bit of a failing if that behaviour piece is missing at the moment from that initiative. So well done.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
Thank you for your talk. You've touched on this slightly, but I wonder if you can talk about it a little bit more, and that is the difference between attitude and behaviour, thinking and acting, especially thinking about things like racism, which tend to persist very much despite all our knowledge and effort. Is it possible that we can change behaviour but not necessarily attitude? If you can comment on that a little bit more.
I'm no expert on this area at all, but one thing that I think is generally true is that if you want to change behaviour and attitudes, starting with behaviour is often more effective than you think. So you might think the obvious thing to do is to change attitudes, and the behaviour will just mysteriously and perhaps naturally flow from that, but it doesn't tend to work that way. So when people start to behave differently and other people around them start to behave differently, we all find ourselves thinking, oh, why am I behaving like this? Well, it must be because my attitudes are X, Y, and Z. Now, so in fact, you start to create the attitudes around which fit the behaviour. So, for example, if you have to recycle, because that's what you're supposed to do, and everyone else is doing it, you find yourself thinking, well, recycling is very important. I can't quite remember where all this recycling is going, or quite why I'm doing it, but I know it's important, I value it. And in fact, we will find ourselves being criticised by our kids and family members for not washing something up properly. There's a whole culture of, in some families anyway, of good quality recycling and it being very important, and of being a pro-recycling attitude. But that isn't generated by directly trying to inculcate the right attitudes. The attitudes are flown from the behaviour. I think that's often true. Now, it's not always true. We need to be careful. If you try to get people to behave in a way which they feel very uncomfortable with and don't really feel is quite right, they feel like it's being imposed upon them, then of course there could be an alternative narrative that people can create. So people are rationalising post hoc, why am I doing this? And they might think, why am I doing this? Well, because I'm forced to. And if I didn't, I'd be, sort of roundly condemned by everybody. But that's just, that's not right. So I think it goes back to this sort of virtual bargaining idea that what we'd like to have is a harmonious society where we don't all agree about everything, but we all think, yeah, these behaviours, these sort of tolerant, reasonable behaviours, and treating each other well, irrespective of variation between people, this is something we're doing because we think that's the way we should live. But of course, if there are some people who are thinking, no, I'm doing it because I'm forced to and I don't like it, then that's something that does need to be addressed. But I think starting with the behaviour normally is the right strategy, and that attitude tumble along behind. I mean, going back to very briefly to the point about risk aversion in policymakers. I mean, seatbelts are a very interesting example here. It's really hard to believe the amount of virulent public opposition and newspaper opposition, and tabloids hated seatbelts, vast attacks on seatbelt legislation. I mean, it's almost unbelievable. The idea that you get in your car and you think, well, this is a real infringement of my liberties, I've got to put this blooming seatbelt on. I mean, it's extraordinary that anyone could think this was an important aspect of freedom. And of course, we've now reduced road deaths through this by quite a large number, many hundreds, perhaps 1,000 a year. Now that's something where the attitude has completely flipped, and now we all think, of course, why on earth wouldn't you wear a seatbelt? You'd be crazy not to, even if no one was looking. So I do think that actually behaviour change can lead, and attitudes do trail along behind, and often, but as I say, not always, quite quickly.
And I mean, going back to your point about racism, and what you're saying there would mean that there would be zero tolerance for racist behaviour at every level in society.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then after a while, that would knock on in terms of
It's a good argument against those who say freedom of speech and prioritising that over really what is...
Yeah, but I think it is complicated. I mean, my instinct is absolutely with you, but I think it is tricky because we also need to avoid people thinking, I think differently, I'm not allowed to say so. I just have to suppress this perspective. Yeah. Well, yes. Yes, strangely, there don't seem to be some holdout seatbelt deniers out there. I don't know why.
But actually, can I say, on the seatbelt issue, this is another example where the multi-level approach is so important, because what happened with that campaign was there was legislation, which is actually a coercion. If you don't do this, you will be punished by being fined, alongside a big mass communication campaign of persuasion, a lot of different persuasive techniques. And I think what we saw there, if we'd had one without the other, it wouldn't have had the success. And, this talk was head and heart. The head and the heart going together, influencing all the different parts of people's motivation is what's likely to be effective.
We have a couple of questions, one at the back.
Hi. I work closely with biochemical engineers at UCL. I'm here, up here. So I work closely with biochemical engineers at UCL, and there are amazing projects out there which are trying to clean the environment or better the environment, such as using genetically modified algae to take up heavy metal pollution out of water and cleaning up the pollution caused by the textile industry. However, when I pitch such projects to my business friends or investors, they would dismiss the project saying that it's too ambitious, it's not going to happen, you're not going to find funding for it. So I know that you've discussed briefly that it's difficult to get funding when projects are ambitious, but are there any other reason why businesses would refrain or be a bit scared to invest in ambitious projects? Are there any psychological stuff going on in their head? I'm sorry, I'm not from the field. And
That's
also,
a very good question.
How can scientists change their behavior or their use of language to encourage businesses to invest in their ambitious projects? Because we need the money.
I think just one very small part of it, I think, is getting changing the reference frame to not, well, no one's doing this at the moment and you should be doing it, to we're all going to be doing this. You know, in 20 years, everyone will be cleaning up heavy metals from all over the place. The whole planet will be full of innovative people doing this because this is a massive problem. And do you want to be part of that or not? Because it's not going to not happen. It's going to happen. And I think this is where things like electrification is a good analogy. I mean, once it becomes obvious, which it is now, that the cheapest way of producing electricity is going to be through renewables, it pretty much almost is in many parts of the world now already, then the kind of question of, well, should we really get on with figuring out how to close down our fossil fuel power stations and put out renewables becomes less of a sort of a question of taking a wild leap in the dark. It becomes obvious this is going to happen. In 20 or 30 years, the world is going to be powered, at least unless things go horribly awry, primarily by renewables, primarily on economic grounds, because it's just the best way to do things. Then the question is, are you going to be a stranded dinosaur company, or are you going to be in the vanguard of this? And I think it's trying to vision the future effectively, which I think a lot of the scientists involved do. They see the world like that, but they may not realize that that's sort of the technical knowledge and understanding they have, which makes them realize, well, of course this is the way to go. Of course everyone's going to be doing this. That is not obvious to the person on, as it were, the other side of the table.
But I think in terms of the right now, whether it's industry or scientists, the bottom line, if somebody's not behaving in the way that you think they should behave, is to ask yourself the question, why should they? Why should they invest? And if there's not an obvious answer to that, then I think that's the answer to your question. And then the challenge is how to make it worthwhile somebody investing. So there's the longer term vision, but also the short term benefits. And one's always trying to get a win-win, in terms of trying to persuade.
Can't nudges also work in that way of
they can,
forcing markets to
some extent? I mean, shifting business behavior is in some ways very different, in some ways very similar to shifting individual behavior. Businesses are generally run by individuals, decisions are made by individuals, albeit in a slightly different context, and there are certain sort of social dynamics going on. And we've done a little bit of work promoting business investment in a manner. In particular, trying to encourage uptake of growth vouchers. Growth vouchers in the UK are basically funds that are available to small businesses to receive financial advice to think about growing and exporting and so on. And even though it's basically free money, uptake is very, very low. So we tried a variety of different framings of messages and so on to increase uptake. And we found that your suggestion around making it the norm, suggesting that thousands of other businesses like yours are doing this, that was somewhat effective, and that was a true statement. Interestingly, the one we found most effective was a message along the lines of, you have been chosen to receive this. And again, that was a true statement. That was a true
Quite
statement.
Biblical.
There was a targeting element to this policy. But, you could perhaps create your own explanation for why that's effective. But there's an element of it not just being some generic campaign. It's an actual genuine offer. It's somewhat exclusive. Perhaps makes it seem a bit more credible as an offer of assistance. So, but actually, we wouldn't have predicted that was the most effective message. We tried about 7 or 8 different messages in a controlled trial. So I guess that speaks to the broader point that human behaviour is complex. It's often very difficult to predict, even with the best theory and the best evidence in hand. So trying stuff and measuring it and seeing what works is often the best approach, in our experience.
So we have about 5 minutes left. Time for 2 questions. I know there has been one here and one here. Shall we start with one here?
Okay, thank you. I'm suffering from the curse of choice because there's so many questions I want to ask. But a lot of us here probably work internationally with international teams. And what we probably all notice is that what works in one culture doesn't work in another one. How generally applicable is behavioural insights and nudging across different cultures?
Yeah, so I can speak to that. So we've done quite a lot of work internationally, a lot in Latin America, parts of Asia, a little bit in Africa. So, I mean, my response to that is generally that as humans, we have certain sort of universal traits, deeply evolved traits that are pretty common across different cultures, But of course, the context within those traits of manifest can be very, very different. So just to give you one example, we are all susceptible to social influence, and we all tend to conform to norms in certain ways. That's a universal trait, but the content of that norm will be very, very different, and the interpretation of that norm will be very, very different. So it really does vary. I think you touch on a very valid point, which is actually the bulk of evidence in this space is from studies that have been done on white, educated, industrialized individuals, often at American universities with American students as a population. So you do have to take with a big pinch of salt a lot of the research out there if you're thinking about applying it in a very different international context. That said, some of the sort of core findings do seem to be pretty robust. But of course, as I said earlier, applying behavioural insights is not about just opening a drawer of tricks and applying them indiscriminately. If you're operating in a different context, you really need to, within that context, understand what are the particular contextual factors, barriers, opportunities, and so on that arise here, and choosing interventions of behavioural insights that really speak to those. So it's kind of a bit of both, I would say.
And one final question here.
The US is so large and there's so many different cultures. So this is kind of what you were just talking about. But there's so many different cultures, and it kind of seems like a lot of people in the US are more resistant to responding to like government policy. They seem to be very like, oh, the government's telling me to do this and I don't want that. So how do you deal with making a behavioral change that kind of needs to happen on a bigger scale and more urgently, such as with climate change? How do you deal with something like that when the change needs to happen more broad and you have a bunch of people who are very resistant to changing what they're doing? Even when it's like with taxes, for example, they don't want to be taxed on things.
I have one thought on that, which is that often the thing you want someone to change has other benefits. Yeah. And often it's better in those sorts of situations to focus on those. So, for example, changing diet, for many people who are having a very heavy meat-based diet, that won't be good for them. So pushing health as the agenda and modelling, looking at the sort of healthy, fit people that we all aspire to be and the kind of things they eat, that's probably a lever to push there. Another one, I think, is what is cool. So one of the things, Tesla have many positive and negative features as an organisation, but one of the things they've done is make electric cars cool. And that's pretty amazing, actually. So I think it's not necessarily the case that one needs to major on this is good for you or good for the planet if that message is going to backfire. In fact, actually, just in general, I think it's actually true that most of the things that we're going to do, I hope, as a world in the next 30 years or so, which will make our lives very different from the way they are now and will reduce greenhouse gas emissions a lot if we do them effectively, will actually be mostly better in many other ways too. So we won't look back on all those sort of exhaust fumes with fond memories, and we will actually be living healthier lives, and that's got to be good on just about all fronts. So I think it's pushing on those co-benefits that's probably the thing to try.
And also I think do always think about the bottom up as well as the top down. It's not just government and do we accept government or not accept government. It's what about what's happening in the communities and the different organisations. And I think the young people's behaviour change and the influence on behaviour change around the climate has been really inspirational. So, we're a complex society. We elect governments, but government's only one part of the picture. And I think it's something that we can all do in terms of taking responsibility for our behaviour, not just for ourselves and our families, but our behaviour in relation to pressurising government to do things differently.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's put our hands together and thank our amazing speakers.